Welcome back to everyone to the jury training course, session 5. We've got two very special talks on tonight, one on judging postal history and the other one is on judging Astrophilately. We're privileged to have Malcolm do postal history because not only is he on the Postal History Commission, he's also an ADP, which means he knows one or two things about stamps and postal history. So without further ado, Malcolm, I'd like to introduce you and just let me know when you want the next slide to go on.
Okay, thanks, Mo. Thanks, Glenn, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone who's attending the seminar. I'm sorry for taking you away from the Olympics, but hopefully you will find the presentation of some use. As I mentioned before, it was interesting to hear the ABC commentators talking about the triathlon and the swimmers diving into the Seine and just going through the motions. Before I start the detail of the seminar, I just want to read you a little story. It's called The Little Boy. Once a little boy went to school. He was quite a little boy and it was quite a big school. But the little boy found that he could go to his room by walking right in from the door outside. He was happy and school did not seem quite so big anymore. One morning when the little boy had been at school a while, the teacher said, "Today we are going to make a picture." Good, thought the little boy. He liked to make pictures. He could make all kinds, lions and tigers, chickens and cows, trains and boats. And he took out his box of crayons and began to draw. But the teacher said, "Wait, it is not time to begin." And she waited until everyone looked ready. "Now," said the teacher, "we are going to make flowers." Good, thought the little boy. He liked to make flowers. And he began to make beautiful ones with his pink and orange and blue crayons. But the teacher said, "Wait, and I will show you how." And it was red with a green stem. "There," said the teacher, "now you may begin." The little boy looked at the teacher's flower, but then he looked at his own flower. He liked his flower better than the teacher's, but he did not say this. He just turned his paper over and made a flower like the teacher's. It was red with a green stem. And pretty soon the little boy learned to wait and to watch, to make things just like the teacher. And pretty soon he didn't make anything of his own anymore. Then it happened that the little boy and his family moved to another house in another city, and the little boy had to go to another school. The school was even bigger than the other one, and there was no door from the outside into his room. He had to go up some big steps and walk down a long hall to get to his room. And the very first day he was there, the teacher said, "Today we are going to make a picture." Good, thought the little boy. And he waited until for the teacher to tell him what to do. But the teacher didn't say anything. She just walked around the room. When she came to the little boy, she said, "Don't you want to make a picture?" "Yes," said the little boy. "What are we going to make?" "I don't know until you make it," said the teacher. "How shall I make it?" asked the little boy. "Why, any way you like," said the teacher. "And any colour?" asked the little boy. "Any colour," said the teacher. "If everyone made the same picture and used the same colours, how would I know who made what and which was which?" "I don't know," said the little boy. And he began to make a red flower with a green stem. I think the moral of that story is that what we're trying to do with judging and exhibiting is not to force people all into the same situation and so that everything looks the same. We've got to accept and understand that people have got different approaches to things, and when we're judging, to take that into account. So you can go to the next page, thanks, Glenn. Called this the order of service, which is basically going through the regulations and guidelines and streamlined seminars that on the FIP Postal History website talk about the judging criteria and the subclasses and how the points are allocated. Do some pre-judging preparation and talk about the criteria that you'll all be familiar with: presentation, treatment and importance, knowledge and research, condition and rarity, and then talk a bit about exhibitor feedback and then have discussions. Next one, thanks, Glenn. Call this one exhibiting versus showing a collection. Many people have got an aversion to exhibiting, but what I'm saying is postal history historians can collect how and what they choose. However, if you're going to exhibit, you've got to understand that there's a set of rules against which an exhibit can be assessed, and that's what we're here to talk about as judges. And I think the point to be made too is that judging and exhibiting are intertwined. If you're going to be a good judge, you need to be a good exhibitor as well. And that's why, and I'm sure the APF have the rules about judging and exhibiting, but to keep your credentials. Special regulations are on the website, and I presume you've all read them or intend to read them at some stage. The special regulations are fairly old, but the guidelines have recently been rewritten and reconstructed and were approved in May 2022. And I think that they're not prescriptive as such, but they're mainly meant to be guidelines as to how each of the criteria should be considered. The details haven't changed very much, but the order in which they're presented are now more in line with the other commissions who've changed their guidelines as well. Next, thanks, Glenn. I'm sure, Glenn, these website addresses can be printed out or given to members of the seminar who want to know them, but rather than go through the tedium of each of the guidelines and the criteria, I think people can go and have a look at them themselves in due course. And I'd recommend that Henrik Moritzen being a professor at a university, is a much better lecturer and talker than I am, but I'd recommend having a look at his seminars, which are on his YouTube channel. The one he gave to the New Zealand Federation, and also particularly a long detailed seminar on rarity and condition and importance, which are well worth watching. Next, thanks, sir. You'll all be familiar with the criteria and the points allocated. Presentation 5, treatment 20, philatelic importance 10, knowledge and research 35 points, and condition and rarity totaling 30. And it's worth considering, which is a point more as much for exhibitors as judges, that 65% of the marks come from areas where the material and the rarity and the money spent on the exhibit don't count. So an exhibitor, if he knows his material, knows his subject, and has the knowledge and research, the 65% off the bat before you start looking at the rarity of the material. Next, thanks for that. The 3 subclasses. You see the key words I've highlighted there. The first is your vanilla standard postal history exhibit, which needs to focus on either rates, routes, postal markings, usages, and postal services such as registration or parcel services, and the various functions of the post office and the postal system. Coughley is subclass 2B, which is classification of postal markings. And the third 2C, which you've heard people talk about 2C all the time, is the historical, social and special studies, which is a broader study of postal history and its interaction with commerce and society and the postal system. And it follows on from the old social class that we had in Australia. So the key words in a postal history exhibit need to be considered when you're judging, looking for used covers and letters, used postal stationery, used postage stamps and postal documents. So the usage is the key. The items need to be used and to be seen to be part of the postal system. And the emphasis is on the rates and the routes and the regulations and the activities relating to the postal services. The treatment should be analysis of postal philatelic objects and the development and operation of one or more of the postal services. Next, thanks, Glenn. You'll often, as judges, come across exhibits where the exhibit is confused between what's traditional and what's postal history. And in many cases, it's simply a case of changing their title or changing their treatment. So there are a lot of exhibitors around that I've found that are keen to show the use of a particular series of stamps, which is really not it's not a postal history treatment, but by simply changing the title and their approach, they can continue to use the same material, but fit it more into postal history exhibiting. So, for example, I've used the use of the Australian Animal Series from 1959 to 1966. We've seen that title judging before, and judges need to be aware that that's not a postal history title. It's talking about the stamps, which belongs in traditional. But if they change the title to the postage rates applying during the use of the 1959 to 1966 Australian Animal Series, they start fitting it in and treating it like the rates. You can still use the same material without straying away from the postal history treatment. And postal rates, Australian postal rates from 1930 to 1946, use the same. You can use the same material, but your treatment's studying the rates, not the stamps. Thanks, Glenn. A bit about the Class 2C exhibits. There are not very many you come across at the moment, which is a bit of a pity, but hopefully people warm to the study of this 2C subject, which is historical geography and how commerce and humanity are using the postal system. So things like advertising envelopes, how postal systems would have evolved to allow commerce to use them. And the historical geography, which is a study of, I've got an exhibit on Western Tasmania, which allows you to use all sorts of other documents that related to the area, like postcards, the illustration side of postcards, documents that have gone through the post, or gives you an opportunity to give a full story of the history of the historical geography of a region or a country. So greeting cards, Christmas cards, there's all documents that have been devised to be sent through the post, gives you an opportunity to use that sort of material in a 2C exhibit. Thanks, Glenn. There are particular aspects in the criteria where, of the 10 points for importance, five under a Class 2C exhibit are made available for the importance of the subject to history or mankind, or the geographic area that's being covered. And the relevance and the balance of a non-philatelic material is important under 2C and should be evaluated under treatment. So you're looking for the knowledge, the subject's that's been chosen, and how much of the non-philatelic material has been included and how relevant it is. Thanks, Glenn. Now here's some homework. I think judges need to consider that you'll all obviously get a list of the subjects, the exhibits you're going to be assigned to in your team. And this is the point where you consider from the title, without having seen the exhibit, is it a postal history topic? Is it likely to be treated as a postal history topic? And how important is the period that they're covering in their exhibit title? And read the title page, which is fairly obvious, but homework, something can be done, and form a preliminary view as to what you're going to experience when you actually judge the exhibit in the frames. Consider the important aspects of the topic, and have a picture in your mind as to what you'd be hoping to see in that exhibit, in terms of the important aspects, and research similar collections, because part of the assessment for importance is deciding whether this is an important exhibit or not. And so you need to know what other exhibits are out there in the exhibiting world. You're obviously not going to know about exhibits that collections have never been exhibited, but at least you have a feeling for whether you're going to be judging an exhibit that's one of a kind, or whether there are many others like it. Check your bibliography. That should be in the introductory page, and draw up a list in your own mind of what you'd hope to be seeing in terms of material and topics within the subject. And try to avoid referring to prior awards. We need to go into judging exhibits without preconceived view as to what it's had in the past. I hope there are no Asian judges listening to this, but they're a bit inclined to decide that this has had a large gold before, so it's going to get a large gold again, which is not a good way to judge. Next, thanks. Presentation. It's only 5 points, but it involves several slides because it can have an immediate effect when you're judging, which you've got to try and resist. If it looks messy, you tend to have a more negative view about the other criteria when you're judging. It's subjective, but some science involved. What I try and do in a judging team is to assess the presentation for all the exhibits in one group, because you get a reasonable comparison between entries. So go through judging each exhibit just for presentation before you just start looking at the other criteria in detail, because you then get a comparison of the better presented exhibits in your team. It also gives you a chance to have a bit of a look at what's coming up ahead of you in all the exhibits in your assignment. It's important to be careful not to let badly presented exhibits or well presented exhibits affect your assessment of the other criteria, which a bit inclined to bad handwriting can affect your assessment of the content of an essay, for example. Next, thanks. So when you're looking at judging presentation, you're looking for balances on the page and within each frame, no limited blank spaces or overcrowding. Clear, so you can have clear headings and typeface used. Handwritten pages are fine, provided they are easy to read. So I wouldn't have a negative opinion of handwritten pages so long as they're clear, and it's not a technological battle in terms of who can use their computer the best, but if someone can do a handwritten exhibit and it's clear to read, that's fine. Lining up the material so you don't have up and down to the pages, so there's balance between the top and the bottom of the page. If they're going to use maps and supplementary illustrations, clear maps that are easy to read and in good quality are important. And we see this on occasions where people have decided they need to put a photocopy of the cover in, and they go and use the cheapest photocopy they can find, and just all you can see when you're judging the pages is these horrible photocopies. And I've even seen examples of maps where the maps are very good, except the route that they're trying to demonstrate, they've used a yellow fluoro pen to outline the route, and all you can see when you look at the page is this horrible yellow fluorescent lines running through the page. It also applies to illustrations of back stamps and postal markings. If you're going to illustrate them, try and make them the best quality as possible. As from talking from a judge's point of view, that's what you'd hope to see. A badly presented exhibit makes you not want to look at it any further. So the judge has got to resist that desire not to. I've judged with groups too, where the exhibit's badly presented, and tends to have an effect on the other criteria when you're considering treatment and importance and knowledge. And you give credit to the exhibitor who can deal with unusual sized covers and the documents and put them in the exhibit in a way that's presentable and pleasing to the eye. Next, thanks, man. As I said, assess how well the challenge of using various size or dealing with various sizes of material and the balance within the page, the frame, and across the frame. Useful use of maps and tables, and we come to knowledge and research. Presenting information as large sentences is very hard to absorb when you're judging, and judicious use of tables and maps is important. Avoid you can go to the other extreme where everything's neatly lined up perfectly throughout the frame, and that can be a bit of the lose marks for presentation, or not, which is not what. Excuse me. It puts you to a disadvantage. And the headings and the subheadings, we're getting into treatment here a bit, but the headings and the subheadings explain the reason for each page. So if the exhibit has chosen to put the name of the title of the exhibit across every page, they're missing the opportunity to put a heading or a subheading that explains why that page is there. And repetition of the titles should be avoided. This is an example of a good page. You've got a heading in bold, a subheading which explains why that part of the treatment is there, why that page is in the order it's in, and like a chapter and a sub-chapter heading.
Right.
An introductory statement at the top of the page as to why that page is there and what introduced the material, and the description of the items should be close and relevant to where they are on the page. Next, thanks, Lou. That's the example of a good page where you've got your heading and the subheading. The heading, the overall title and subject or chapter is independent post offices, and the reason for that page is talking about the fifth rate period. And in order to easily present and digest the information, tables have been used which are easy to understand and don't involve masses of text. Thanks, Graham. The page on the left is an example of where it becomes very confusing. You've got introductory text, several parts of it, you're not sure what it's relating to, and the descriptions of the two covers are down the bottom, and you've got to work out what's relating to what. And the frame on the right, you've probably seen exhibits like that where someone's gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure everything's lined up, and it's not a top presentation. Thanks, man. You get balance in looking at presentation too, balance within the pages where they've got gaping holes and blank spaces, which the exhibitor needs to consider what could be better, how better to present that page, and what else could be used to fill the gaps. And one of the little bugbears too, tendency to put matting behind items and then don't do a very good job of it, which can, just two examples of bad matting, which can lose points when you're judging. If they go to the trouble of getting some nice material, but then can't spend the time to put even matting around it doesn't help the material. Thanks, mate. Move on to treatment and importance, which is basically judging the challenge that they've set themselves by the topic they've chosen, and then assessing how well the exhibitors met that challenge. Importance is one of those subjects that gets debated between exhibitors and judges more often than anything else, I think. And Postal History Commission follow the system, the process now where we, of the 10 points that are available, we split into two. So the significance of the subject, the importance of the subject, and the importance of the exhibit. The 5 points for each. So a total of 10, but we'll move on to the next slide and I'll explain how that is addressed. Thanks, Glenn. If you've got a subject called Postal History of Tasmania, 1852 to 1891, it's important as a subject in its own right. So you probably give 4 to 5 points out of the 10 for that. If it's an important exhibit, which is where the work you should do beforehand as your homework, is to decide, is this exhibit of Postal History of Tasmania likely to be the only one, or are there several others that you know of that are equally important? So in assessing the importance of this particular exhibit, you need to consider that is it the most important one that you're aware of, or are there several others? So your assessment of points, if it is one of an important exhibit in the subject, you get 4 or 5 points. So your total comes to 8 or 10, which avoids this problem of the past where someone shows penny blacks of GB and everyone says, oh, that's 10. It's an important subject, and they don't take into account, is this exhibit of penny blacks not so important? So you've got the exhibitor tends to appreciate that if they think their exhibit is important and you agree with them, they've got their 5 out of 5 for importance of their exhibit. But then you can focus on the fact that they've chosen a subject that isn't particularly important, and that's why they've got 3 out of 5 for that. So you come up with your 8 out of 10 still, but they understand why they didn't get a 9 or a 10, because it's the importance of the subject that's affecting their assessment, not the importance of their particular exhibit. So you can have less debate about whether the Postal History of Launceston is as important as the Postal History of Tasmania. It's not, and no one is particularly going to argue that that's the case. So your assessment out of the 10 points is much easier to defend when you're judging. Thanks, mate. And the general common sense says that the broad scope subjects are generally more important than narrow scope subjects. However, the problem that the exhibit is going to face is the judge has to assess is if it's a broad scope exhibit, how well can you show it in 5 or 8 frames? So you need to consider they've chosen Postal History of the World. It's impossible to show in 8 frames the best of times. So that's the scope. And the time period, the broader the time period, the more important it is in the postal history of a type of a subject. But one thing we try and emphasise too in postal history is that early period, the classic period, was always considered to be more important. But if you have the postal history of modern countries like Israel or People's Republic of China or Vietnam, for example, that they can be equally important as a subject in their own right. And the little in the box, the green box at the bottom, I think we as judges need to keep the hobby healthy by recognising being more amenable towards modern period and modern topics. And we thankfully get fewer and fewer judges who carry the view that if it's not classic, it's not important, which is not the case. We're not going to have a thriving exhibiting hobby if we only recognise classic exhibits as being important. So, thanks, mate. Treatment. Assess what the objective of the exhibitor is, and are they intending to show rates, routes and markings and usage, and under what legislative regime they're doing it. How well has the exhibitor developed the particular aspect that he's chosen to do, which is should be obvious from the introductory page what their intention is. And then they've got to assess how well they've met their objective. And the focus of the treatment should be on the topic, on the aspect of the postage that they've chosen to show. And if there should be a logical thread through the exhibit, avoid flip-flopping, as we call it, where they get one page is showing a rate, the next page is showing a service. There should be some sort of process, logical sequence, and the story should flow. And we've used the example if the exhibit is dropped on the floor in the bin room, someone in the bin room should be capable of picking it up again and putting it back into its right order without looking at the page numbers. An exhibit that works, give it to someone who doesn't understand it, shuffle it up and say, bring it back to me in some sort of order. So as a rule of thumb, as the judge, you can say, well, does this exhibit have a flow? Does it have a system? And can I follow it through the headings and the subheadings and the order in which they've chosen to do it? Next, thanks, Liam. The judge needs to assess whether the exhibit has chosen the right means of showing the exhibit, of treating it, whether chronological is the logical way, whether rate periods, whether it's the service, different services, whether the routes have been grouped properly, and if it's geographical, how well has it been defined, and if it's jurisdiction, has it been treated by postal acts or regulations, and if it's a study of postal services, like a railway mail or shipping services, under what conventions has it been treated? And when you're judging, you've got to decide, is the scope adopted the best approach? And has the exhibitor tackled the most important periods? It's a trap for judges that the exhibitors deliberately or unwittingly chosen a date period that's left out the most important part of the postal history of that country. Sometimes they can be sneaky and deliberately do so, but sometimes they don't have the material, so they can't cover the period. Next, thanks, Liam. There should be an agreement between the title, the plan, and the content. One of my favourite approaches is the introductory page should have a plan of some description, and this is something that thematics has taught postal history exhibitors, that the thematic exhibitor is much more experienced in getting a topic and deciding how their plan should approach to showing material for the topic. And postage exhibitors need to learn from that, how thematic exhibitors go about treating it, the subject. So you need to, as judges, assess whether the plan that they've shown on their title page is a logical one, and then the pages that follow in the frames that come after you should be able to see whereabouts in the plan the story flow is matching up. Does it flow smoothly from page to page and item to item? and have a useful, successful conclusion. Headings and subheadings is the best way to do that. If the exhibitor's got clear headings and the subheadings that explain what part of the heading that chapter that the pages relate to, it's a sign of a good treatment. Thanks, mate. As an example, the title tells you what the treatment is and what the ambition of the exhibitor is. Then he explains how he's going to go about showing you the postal beginnings of Niagara Falls. So you've got the whereabouts they're talking about, when, what period, and what they're trying to show. So there's a clear title, the scope and intention are there. What's going to be shown in the period covered. Thanks, man. Introductory pages are one of the most important starts to an exhibit. A, because the judge is going to receive that in the pre-judging papers. So that's going to set up you as the judge is going to have a preconceived view as to what you expect to see. Which isn't a bad thing, but from the exhibitor's point of view, he needs to get the message across to this is the title of my exhibit, and this is how I intend to show it to the viewer. And the judge needs to assess whether they consider this the optimum approach to treating the subject, and whether the order that the exhibitor's chosen to show it as is appropriate. There's a lot of discussion about synopsis. It's not mandatory, but it assists the judge in preparing for the judging. And I think the real benefit is for the exhibitor, because to write a successful synopsis means that the exhibitor has to get their head around what the topic they've chosen to show. And if they can't write the synopsis, they need to consider how their general approach to the subject. But one of the dangers of, and particularly US synopsis that I've seen, is the risk of trumpet blowing and the BS that can be put into a synopsis. You've got to be wary that you're not being hoodwinked into thinking this is the best exhibit since sliced bread. Next thing, sir. Rarity and condition. You've got to, this is where your homework comes into it as well. Know what key items might be missing. Missing items affect treatment more than rarity, because if you can't show a rare item, you can't tell that part of the story. So it's more a weakness in treatment than it is in rarity. And there's objective rarity and relative rarity. The best extreme example is there's a difference in the rarity between an invitation envelope bearing a penny post office Mauritius versus a cancellation with an inverted year figure, even if only 3 of each items have been recorded. You've got to assess whether there's a real rarity or whether it's imputed rarity. Contrived rarity statements, you'll come across them as judges where there's the so what factor. So what if this is the only example with an inverted date plugged? Is that important to the story you're trying to tell, or is it might be rare, uncommon or rare, but it's not important to the story? Next, thanks. One of the things to be wary of is when you're judging is repetition of rare items. I judged an exhibit of Mauritius. There were 2 Mauritius exhibits. One was full of post office paid Mauritius on cover, and the one next to it was the later period of Mauritius. The later period of Mauritius scored more points because it had the treatment and the knowledge. And whereas the first one got full marks for rarity, there was no thread in the story, and the lack of knowledge. So the points available could easily be assessed on the second Mauritius exhibit, which was different period, not so much rarity, but knowledge and treatment were all there. So beware of repetition of rare items. That's what I'm trying to say. Judge should consider only what the exhibit contains. An exhibit with only ordinary items cannot get high marks in rarity, which is fairly self-explanatory. You can still award full marks, maximum points for if just a few rarities are missing, so long as the treatment flows and that there's all the items necessary to give a good treatment and knowledge are there. This little matrix that Henry Morrison devised, so I credit to him. If you're assessing condition, top common items need to be the best, absolute best condition, whereas few known or unique items, you give a little bit more leeway in terms of awarding points for condition. And the some items, if they're common and they're poor quality, it should be fairly harsh on the points you award for condition. There's a link between rarity and condition. You can have a bit more leeway in terms of poor, if that's all that's available. That shouldn't affect the points you award for condition. Next, thanks, Glenn. Indicating rarity. Rather than just saying this is unique or this is rare, knowledge can be assessed better if the exhibitor explains why it's rare and based on either a date period or likely population where the item originated from would suggest that it was rare, and in particular, really good exhibits show the knowledge of the exhibitor comes through because they've done a census of particular covers, and they can explain that in the 30 years that they've been studying the subject, there are only 2 or 3 of these have been recorded. And that sort of information gives the judge an opportunity to assess whether the rarity is genuine rarity and how did the exhibitor come to the conclusion that it was rare. I'm not keen on red dots and arrows and things that don't tell you anything. It's better to, if the exhibitor can explain how he's come to the conclusion, quantitative statements based on personal research, such as census, aids, marks of knowledge and personal research, as well as supporting the rarity statement. Thanks, mate. Well, that's fairly the best conditions available for that particular material. Obviously, the obvious exceptions are disaster mail and disinfected mail. The military mail, you're not going to find it in the perfect condition, or if you can, it's exceptional. But judges should consider circumstances in which that mail was used. And also, I think you have trouble with European judges too, that they believe everything should be in Swiss condition, which is not always the case. If you're a collector of colonial Australia, you have a different threshold as to what's the best quality available to those who judge European postal history. Thanks, mate. Assessing what the exhibitor knows about the material. There's implicit knowledge by the selection of the material he's put in the exhibit. There's explicit knowledge, which is based on the explanations and analysis and the background knowledge that's demonstrated in the write-up. Looking for new information when you're assessing the research and postal study, give some leeway for an exhibitor who's chosen a well-trodden path, and the only way you can assess their knowledge is their knowledge of the literature that's been previously recorded. And evidence, another way of assessing research and personal study is evidence of articles written by the exhibitor in the bibliography that you've received in the introductory page. And once again, census if an exhibitor's gone to spend 30 years gathering information on numbers of covers in particular categories, areas, that's a good evidence of research. Their ability to pick the eyes out of the information they want to provide is also a good way of assessing knowledge and research. They haven't presented a page full of verbiage. Their knowledge also comes down to how well they can pick the eyes out of the relevant information. Thanks, Glenn. One of the litmus tests that I use is, having spent time reading and considering the exhibit, the end of the 8 frames or 5 frames, what more do you know about the subject? And if you think, well, I'm still confused, is it me or is it the exhibitor failing to get the story across through a full lack of knowledge of what the subject is and what the important parts of the story are? Some of the pitfalls that when you're judging to look out for is exhibitors trying to write a book about the topic, and as you'll all be aware if you've judged at all, you only have so much time to study an exhibit, and if you've got 10 or 15 exhibits in front of you and you're confronted with pages and pages of write-up, you're not going to read it all, and so it's the ability of the exhibitor to get their message across in the time that the judge has available to study it. They're not going to have time to read large amounts of text, so they can say what they like and you're not going to be able to assess it. And so, implicit and explicit knowledge. What's been left out and what's been included is implicit knowledge. Has the exhibit included all the relevant material? Sometimes what might be more common material is just as important to keep the story flowing as a group of rare covers. Not everything in the story is going to be rare, so the selection of material is important in assessing the knowledge of the exhibitor. And the explicit knowledge is self-explanatory, that having put an item on the page, the relevant item, the information describing that item should be accurate. And if they've chosen to include some social background information, it should add something to the story, not just be part of filling up a space. So they can, if there's an interesting letter written by an important person, a few words explaining who that person was, something adds a lot of depth to the exhibit. Thanks, mate. The recognition of an untrodden aspect of post history is going to be higher marks for personal study. And as I said earlier, if it's a well-trodden subject that's been shown by many people before, the challenge for the exhibitor is to show that they know what literature has been written and find some new approach to presenting it. And one of the things that comes under personal study is if they're showing them an item that's been altered or they don't know about it, it's obviously going to affect your assessment of their personal study and research, unless they're knowingly showing them an altered item, which is even worse. Thanks, man. We get to exhibitor feedback, which is most important. When you consider how much the exhibitor's spent on frame fees and how much of his own personal time he spent preparing the exhibit, it's extremely important for the judges to be able to give positive feedback and an opportunity to explain to the exhibitor where they can improve. And one of the things I try and emphasise too, it's important that in the marking criteria, the weaknesses are matched up to the points that you've allocated. And one of the dangers of judging is that you form an opinion that it's a large silver exhibit, and the points in each criteria represents large silver, when in fact presentation could still be 5 and rarity condition can be 10, but the problem might be in knowledge or the problem might be in treatment. So it gives you an opportunity in front of the frames to explain to the exhibitor where the points can be gained, and it's important to focus on where more points can be gathered without buying more material. So try and give your feedback based on what's still in the frames, but how it might be better treated or better knowledge shown. And written feedback's also important. I know the APF are very, very good on this in terms of how much time and effort goes into getting written feedback for the exhibitor, because that, at the end of the day, that's all they have to show. A nice medal, but the written feedback's the thing that should be guiding them when they should decide they want to show it again and how they can improve it. And on a number of occasions, if you don't have enough time in front of the frames to give the verbal feedback, it's sometimes useful for the exhibitor, if they can provide you with a copy of their exhibit, to take it home and spend a bit of time yourself working out how and giving much longer written feedback for them, so they get some real benefit from having shown their exhibit. So I think that's the last slide, Glenn, isn't it? Thank you for listening. I hope that was some help.
Oh, that was fantastic, Malcolm. Really appreciate it. So we'll start off. Is there any questions for Malcolm on postal history? Well, I've got one, Malcolm.
Yeah,
actually, I've got a couple. So when you look at a good postal history treatment, you read it and go, I get it, it's fantastic, it gets good marks. But then you get a postal history where you're struggling to work out what are they trying to say, what are they trying to do, and they probably doing a lot of flip-flop, as you mentioned, but they haven't treated it well and you've scored it poorly. And when you're in front of the exhibitor and you say, look, the treatment, really suffered, and they say, well, how would you treat it? What's the responsibility of the judge to come up with a better way to treat it, or recommend them to go and see somebody? How would you handle that situation, Malcolm?
I've had conversations with exhibitors in front of the frames and just ask the question, why have you put that there? Why do you show it in that order? And once they get starting and start talking about their subject, you learn a lot more from listening to them talking about the topic than you actually get off the frames. And it's often a useful practical example of saying to them, well, if you what you're telling me was actually on your pages, there's your treatment improved for starters. And the more when you talk to the exhibitor, you often find that they know much more about the exhibit than they actually showing on the pages. So it's probably a question of saying I can't understand why you've shown that there, and why you've chosen chronological as opposed to postal acts or regulations. When the topic of the title of your exhibit is such and such, well, why would you choose? Ask them the question: why did you choose chronological when it might have made more sense if it was by acts or regulations? Get them talking. I find getting them talking about as long as they're not cross and angry and they're red in the face and they want to have a fight with you for the start, you can pick those sort of people before you started. But most of the time, we get into a conversation to get them to explain why they've chosen to treat it the way it is and how that can be seen as confusing to someone. The first thing you do is admit too that they're going to know a lot more about the topic than you do, unless they've had the misfortune of being judged by someone who's won a large gold for the same topic. Then you've got a bit more of an advantage. But more often than not, the exhibitor is going to know more about the topic than you will. But one of the tests, as I said during the presentation, was that if you can judge something and go through it and read it and you know something more about it at the end, it must be working to some degree.
Yep. That's a good answer. Thanks, Malcolm. I appreciate that. So before we go on to the next subject, this last chance if anyone else has got a question to ask Malcolm. Or if you think of it during the next presentation, write it down. We can ask him again at the end. So we'll encourage Malcolm to hang on.
I'm about to learn something about Astrophilately, Glenn.
Oh, definitely. It's the #1 topic. Don't you worry about that. Thank you very much, Malcolm. So I'm going to ask Charles to share, and the advantage of Charles is we've seen him before because he was on session 1, so we know his style and we're very happy with his pace and everything. He doesn't really need any introduction, but Charles, thanks again for sharing Astrophilately, and he's also on the Astrophilately Commission. So you're hearing it right from the beginning. So thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you. So welcome to Astrophilately tonight. Tonight we'll be going through the basics, and we'll be looking at philatelic material and, of course, how to judge astrophilately. I've got to tick on what? Okay.
No, you're right. Excuse me. Let me get rid of that for you.
Mm-hmm.
Click OK. Click.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, where's your little thing? Huh?
Yeah, it came lower down now.
There, click that. Go.
Right, I think we're up and running now. So what we'll be looking at is some of the astrophilatelic basics, the appropriate material that people will use, and then finally how we're going to judge it. There'll be a sessions after each of the 3 sections that we've got. We'll see how we go. Oh, I can hear a background. Right, so what we're going to look at is astrophilately. We're looking at space flights, space-related events, and in particular, what we're going to look at is how astrophilately is different from the other classes. In the old days, we used to be dumped in with thematics, and then for a brief period, we were with aero, and then we became a class by ourselves. Basically, we're more like a postal history, so anything that you've learnt before with Malcolm, you can mainly apply through astrophilately as well. The main thing is the key issues that we're going to look at is the postmark, as it's the most important element of all philatelic covers. Now we're going to look at some examples. So the first rule is cancellation has to be from the correct location. Space flights, of course, don't just occur anywhere. There's specific localities for them. So launches take place, for example, in the States at Kennedy Space Center, in Russia at Baikonur. So launches are always at that specific site. The recovery, that means when they return to Earth. The US used to prefer ships, so the capsule would land in the ocean somewhere, and then a ship would come and recover it. The Russians and the rest of the world do have their landings back on Earth again, so somewhere in Kazakhstan or anywhere out in Siberia they'll land. After the launch, the main issue is, of course, control centers. Launches are one thing, but the control center takes over about 5 minutes into every launch. In the United States, it's Houston, and in Russia, it's back near Moscow. Supporting material like tracking stations, support aircraft, you can include those, but all of those covers have to be, of course, within the period of that launch window. Cancellations from other locations are just not suitable. What we're looking at here is a moon landing cover. Now that was taken over by Mission Control, so it's Houston on the correct day of the launch. Here we have another one. Basic information is the cancellation must have the correct date. So it's the exact date of the event. Here it's a launch cover. So this is taking place in French Guiana. So the correct place, but the correct date as well, 27th of October. If that was a Sunday, typically the next working day is all right. But the left-hand side for this cover is a neat cachet, but it could have been blank, and then the cover would be just as valid. Modern day covers do have very colourful left-hand sides, but they're really not very important. The basic write-up of a philatelic item is a key issue. You need to include dates, the location, and you need to write up the purpose of the flight, any key aspects of that flight with technical data, any activities that were taken on board. Do they have payloads? Often they're carrying another satellite on board, which is launched from that capsule. You need to note all those sort of details on your covers. And basically, they're just the three important items that you can do in Astrophilately. Are there any questions?
Yeah, is there a lot of material for Astrophilately?
Right. If we say, was there much early material? Nowadays, we will usually start at World War II, where you have the V2s being taken off during the war. And then after that, the amount increases enormously once we get to about the 70s.
Okay.
And then after the 70s, not only have you got Russia and America creating a lot of material, very soon in the 90s, China has enormous amounts of material being produced. And nowadays, India has joined the space race as well. So the amount of material now is very, very accessible across at least 4 continents. And Australia
Okay, cool.
sometimes has material, but not that often, because we're not very good at communicating with the philatelists when we're going to have launches.
Charles, occasionally you see envelopes a bit like that, but they've been signed by the astronauts. Has that got any significance at all in terms of Astrophilately?
It's always nice if they've been signed by the astronauts, but it doesn't add to Astrophilately's score in terms of rarity or importance. It's just a nice item to have, but it is not important for the cover.
And is there a society or whatever that actively creates or promotes this with space launch? I'm thinking now in New Zealand we've now got a space station we're launching quite regularly, but I've got no idea whether they're producing Astrophilately to commemorate or to celebrate that.
I haven't seen material come out of New Zealand yet myself either. What usually would happen is that a keen philatelist in New Zealand would produce the covers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they create enough of them and there's enough demand for them, then the trade takes over and then they could start doing them. So in Australia, we had that at Woomera as well. In the early days, if they were lucky, they were processing, say, 100 covers. And by the end of their program in Australia, they were producing thousands of covers.
Yeah. Well, last year, I understand we launched more rockets into space than any other country in the world.
Yes. Australia had that same thing in the 50s.
Yeah.
But there were no covers from that period, really, except some military mail.
So do the launches have to be done by governmental agencies, or can it just be private?
No.
Launching?
Nowadays in America, they're private agencies that are mainly launching. And in Australia, it's sort of private and universities that are involved in the space launches.
Charles, a question. Is it difficult to access information about payloads and what some of the flights are doing with different countries or
Usually,
security or-
so if we're talking about America, it's easy.
Yeah.
They're well documented. Russia's early material is now well documented, but day to day, you need to go looking for it in Russia. There are plenty of people that you can correspond with, but you do need to write Russian most of the time. And then China and India, they do have their own societies that are producing material for you.
Charles, I know that you've got more to come. I just thought others may think that was the end of your presentation. It's a break.
Okay.
Keep going.
Now we'll be looking at material. So the type of material that you have in Astrophilately, the key items are event covers and space mail, but you could have any other type of philatelic item, ranging from stationery down to stamps. Event covers. The event covers are covers that relate to launches, dockings, landings. Key item about them is they're close to the launch site or the landing site. They've got the right date. They're close to mission control. If it was on board, so once they're in space, you may only have to use things like Houston, and they have to be in the vicinity of the control center, or if you had a crash, where the crash was. Special cancellations are only relevant if the cancellation relates to the event, and anniversary cancellations are just not suitable at all. There are so many of them, and they're not suitable. Here we're going to look at a couple. Usually I'll have on the left-hand side the appropriate cover, and then on the right-hand side a related cover, but they're not really appropriate for what they're trying to display. So on the left-hand side, we have a Kennedy space mark from the Kennedy Space Center, and it's a typical cover. As you can see, it's got a cachet, it's got a postmark, and that's a key item for that cover. And this one was signed by the astronauts. On the right-hand side, we've got the right date, and if we read the handwritten note that it says Apollo 12 launch, yes, it is the right date for the launch, but Albrook Air Force Base is in Panama, nowhere near the launch site at all. So it might have the correct date, but the place of the cancel, which is the key for that cover, is not correct. So you wouldn't be showing that as a launch cover. You could use our Albrook Air Force Base, Panama, if you were doing some preliminary work in terms of where the astronauts were trained, because it is a training base for jungle landings if the capsule got into trouble. Now we've got an Australian cover from Woomera. It's a launch cover, so it's correct date with the launch site there posted at Woomera. On the right-hand side, we have a Russian item. It's a wrong location. It's nowhere near Baikonur. It shows Gagarin, only it's now the 15th anniversary, and anniversary covers really don't matter at all. So it's not a useful item to show a launch with an anniversary cover from a place that's nowhere near the launch site. Landing covers, very important part of the mission is the landing. As I said, in the US, the landings were all in the water up until the end of the Apollo missions. So it's a ship cancellation with a ship cachet, right date. On the right-hand side, it says the landing was at Cape Canaveral. Well, that's a launch site. It's not a landing site, so it's not useful as a landing cover at all. Then you can have EVAs, that's extravehicular activities, that's walking around in space or docking. All of that can be shown as long as it's the correct place, like Korolev is where the Mission Control Center is. And in the States, we already saw that it was Houston. So during the mission, they always have to be from the control center, not from launch sites. And you can have event covers that support facilities like tracking stations, secondary recovery ships. Well, by that we mean when the ships are out there waiting for the capsule to come back to Earth, in America, they will be in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean. The ships will be there all over the oceans. And the secondary ones are the ones that are there just in case it doesn't land in the right spot. And so you have secondary recovery ships that are there. And the official caches will be preferred rather than simply an envelope with a cancel on it, because most of those areas do have nice caches. Then the other part of modern astrophilately is space mail. That's mail that has actually been flown on board a spacecraft. They are classified typically by the spacecraft. They're cancelled on board. They usually have an onboard postmark, a cache, often authenticating signatures. Because the Russians, of course, soon created post offices in their space stations. The post office in the space station produces a lot of mail during their missions. People send letters to and from space in the supply ships that go to the space station, and they often have their own mail on board, which then becomes part of Astrophilately. And we'll give you some examples now. Both of those are pieces of space mail, one from the Russian program and one from the Chinese program. If we look at the Russian one, there's an onboard cancel, so that canceller was only available on the ship. There are some authenticating signatures that say, yes, they cancelled it on board their spacecraft. If we look at the Chinese one, if you look very carefully, you can see the imprint in the envelope, which is a dry seal imprint. There are usually two cancels on Chinese covers. The first one is the day that it went into a capsule before the launch. And then when it lands, on the back of the cover, there'll be another postmark to show that it has been recovered. Many signatures are on board, which is usually the crew and anybody involved in the flight. And then interesting that part of the cover, but they're not important in their terms of astrophilately. Rather than just covers, you can have telegrams. In the Chinese option, they are often taking philatelic material because the post offices are very much involved in the Chinese astrophilately. And this is a miniature sheet that, again, has two cancels, when it went on board and when it was returned. Other material that you have is stamps, postal stationery, special cancellations. Lots of material is available. Stamps and postal stationery, though, must be issued by the countries involved in the space event within 12 months of the event. So anniversary covers and postal stationery that's created much later is not useful at all for an exhibit. And they should never have words like anniversary. Special cancellations are only when there are no event covers. In the early days of Russia, there weren't really event covers because Baikonur was a secret base. And so you could only have cancels from post offices in Moscow or in Kiev. And up until about 1975, all of those are all right to show. But after 75, Baikonur opens, and that's a launch site. And if launches are done in Russia, they must have the Baikonur postmark. First day of issue postmarks should be shown unless they actually coincide with the event. And it's only happened twice in the United States. And the important thing is that stamps and stationery and the like shouldn't be dominating the exhibits. As we can see, in stratosphere, you can show the stratosphere stamps. However, if you were doing the European Space Agency, a Liberian miniature sheet of the 5th anniversary is just not appropriate at all. Liberia was never involved in the space program. Nice piece of miniature sheet, but really not related to Astrophilately at all. Special cancellations, so the one on the left, as I said, that was Russia before 75. So you could have Kiev or Moscow, that's usable. But the one on the right is way outside of the period, it's 79. So Baikonur has been well established. And so club cancels of that period are just not part of Astrophilately and should never be shown. First day covers, interesting, but not part of Astrophilately. So best never to show them. Any questions? Okay, no questions, then I'll continue on. Now we're going to look at exhibiting subjects in Astrophilately. You could have precursors to rocket flights. So in the early days, there was rocket mail, stratosphere balloons, looking at the development of various rocket types. That will be covered. Most prominent ones that you see now are manned space flights, but you could have unmanned programs like interplanetary probes, where they went to Venus, Mars, Mercury. At this stage, I think we've been to all the planets, so they've all been visited. We've even sent probes beyond our solar system, hoping one day to go somewhere out in the deep space. But you could do weather satellites as well. The manned programs really relate to one country or one program. The main ones are now the USSR, of course, Russia, USA, China, Europe, India has started. Programs that are really important are the Soyuz or the Apollo. In China, the Shenzhou program, and Europe has the Ariane. So you could have an exhibit all about Ariane, or you could have it all about the Chinese program, which is very popular in China, of course. An all-encompassing exhibit will be the history of space exploration, from precursors to space stations. It's very difficult to do that very well because it's often hard to show the most important items if you're doing a whole history of space. Then the judging criteria are virtually the same as the ones we've just gone through with Malcolm. So treatment, philatelic importance, philatelic and related knowledge, personal study and research, 35 marks, condition and rarity, exactly the same, 10, 20, and presentation, 5 marks. And for each of those criteria, the discussion is going to be virtually the same that we've just had. So if we look at the treatment, on the title page, you need the plan, you need a purpose, you need to say what the scope is. There should be a rarity comment somewhere on that page saying how you're going to show those important items, and you need your references so that the judges have time to go and study that part of the Astrophilately. The content needs to reflect the title and the purpose and the scope. They have to fit nicely together, and the plan should be readable, logical, easy to follow. You need a completeness of material that's shown within a scope. What you're not going to show, you should also say. Primary focus is going to be on the event covers. Precursors, if they had any, and only a token showing of common material. The better material should be shown in depth. Importance is very similar again. The significance of the actual exhibit and the overall significance of the subject. So again, we split it into 2, 5 marks each. How important is something in terms of world astrophilately? And then how important is the exhibit itself relative to space exploration? Often you will see that people do the US program. They do a lot on Apollo, but they do very little on the early days of Mercury and, say, Gemini. Question you always ask is how much key material is present. When we're looking at space mail, do they have the key space mail items? So if you had, say, the Apollo project, Apollo 14, there are only 30 covers produced. On the other hand, for Apollo 15, there are nearly 750 covers produced. So the relative importance is also very a key when you're doing your judging. Philatelic knowledge and personal research is virtually the same. Have you used appropriate literature? Have you chosen the best items with the correct explanation? How appropriate is your write-up? Do you include technical evolution and chronology? Are you going to show some precursors? Is it a full understanding of the subject or just a cursory glance at it? Just the covers by themselves is rarely enough. Then condition. Is the material overall good condition? We do remember that, of course, it's all post-1945. And once you get to about 19s, or say 70, we expect the covers to be perfect condition. Unless there was a crash, then you could look for crash material that has not such good material. But otherwise, it's always in perfect condition. And only the rare material might be in fine condition, especially if it's been out in space. Because as much as it's easy to cancel an item in the post office here on Earth, cancelling material in space, you don't have the beauty of gravity helping you, and so it's hard to get the cancel on the right spot for you and have a complete cancel. In terms of rarity, it's similar again, the difficulty of acquisition. Is it the most appropriate item? Are they present? Are there too many of the same items available in the exhibit? Is common material mustn't dominate? And how hard would it be to duplicate the exhibit? Often you will see that we concentrate on, say, the US or the Europeans will have their European material, the Russians will have the Russian, and the Chinese are really good at showing Chinese material, but rarely show anything from other countries at all. So you need to make sure that the topic and the scope allow you to see that where the gaps are in the rare items. Presentation is very similar. Balance in the frame, a good use, not too much white space, careful mounting. Malcolm's already told us the problem with having tram lines. The clear write-up, concise and relevant. It's nothing as off-putting for a judge as having pages and pages of writing to go through. It needs to be concise and clear. Any questions? Okay. Now, if you have anything that you would like to find out about Astrophilately, the best place is to go to the Astrophilately website, which is on the FIP and on the APF website. So you can find the links there. And the seminars are there. Most of the material is there. And it's usually up to date in terms of what's happening in the world of astrophilatelic exhibiting.
Charles, if you stop sharing, we can all talk.
Will do.
There we go.
Oh, thank you very much, Charles. That was excellent. Actually, I'm starting to get a bit excited about looking at my first astro and trying to judge it myself. I'm hoping that's in Shanghai. I'm sure there'll be some astros.
There will be lots in Shanghai.
I'll be looking forward to them. I don't know if I can read the Chinese, but I'm going to
Well, that will be the problem. You will need to be. Very few of them have got English text on them.
Yeah. So two questions in scope. Is there enough material to do the space shuttle? Because obviously that's got a finite scope because it's no longer being used. Is there enough material to do 8 frames?
Yes, you could fill at least 8 frames of shuttle material.
Yeah.
It's a relatively long period of time in Astrophilately.
Yep.
And lots of flights. So multiple spacecraft, 2 disasters. So there's disaster mail. So there's a lot that you can do with that.
Yeah. And what about North Korean rocket mail? Is that anything? Because, I mean, obviously they fire a lot of rockets.
If you can get hold of any astrophilatelic item that came from North Korea, please let me know.
All right. You've got the challenge out there. We're going to all look for you, Charles.
The most recent ones are coming from India that has now been able to land on the moon.
And what about the Chinese trying to land on the dark side of the moon? Has that happened yet?
Yes, they will have covers as well.
Yeah.
And Chinese covers you could fill in 10, 15, 20 frames easily.
Yeah. I'll look forward to that.
It's very popular. All of Europe would have maybe, I'll be kind, 30 collectors. In China, the Chinese Astrophilatelic Society, when I was there 4 years ago, had 1,500 members. So it's very popular there. There are lots of collectors. It's the only place that I can go to where I'm actually known by face for some reason.
You don't look Chinese, that's why.
No, I don't look Chinese, but they all want signatures.
All right.
It's always fun to be a judge in China.
Yeah. All right. I'll put it out there. So if anyone's got any other questions for Charles and or Malcolm on anything that's been shown tonight or anything, they're quite happy to answer. Please do it now. And when that's finished, I'll stop recording and we can do the general chit chat if we want to talk about anything else.
Just a general question for Charles. Because it's astrophilately and some of the information may be classified, is that a barrier to research on a lot of the topics? You're not going to get information on certain things because it's classified?
Not really. In the States, it hasn't been classified probably for the last 20 years, if it ever was classified.
Yeah.
In Australia, it is difficult to find information pre about 1960, even though by the time the Americans and the Russians get into space, Australia has been doing it since 1947. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of launches at Woomera.
Yeah.
But none of them has got philatelic material for it. There is military mail from that period, and you can be lucky and have military mail that says last week or yesterday or this morning I was at the launch.
Right. Thank you.
And in New Zealand, we need to find somebody who wants to produce covers for the recent launches that we're getting there. And the same in Australia. By the time I got hold of anybody who could do a cover for me up in Northern Australia, they'd finished, because they're really not into commercialising the flights at all.
All right. Looks like the questions have come to an end. Look, this has been a very useful two sessions, and I appreciate both of the speakers for giving us their time for doing that. What I will do now is end the session by stop recording with a bit of luck.